Hi, this is going to be a general video on classical music. I've wanted to make something like this for a long time. I did make my one video on Ravel, and I do plan on doing another one soon. I'm trying to decide between Rachmaninoff and Shostakovich, because those are the two I feel most confident about. But anyway, yeah, this is going to be a more general video on classical music where I basically just talk about what I like listening to most and just kind of general comments on things because I always wished there was more of like a community on classical music on YouTube because there's a huge community as far as posting works and posting performances and recordings and things, and I love that. But there's not really a large community of talking about classical music that I found. There's one guy, Samuel Andreev, which if you like classical music and you haven't listened to his stuff yet, it's very good. He does have a I would say a very particular focus as far as what you could call more avant-garde 20th century stuff, like Stockhausen, um, just like all the names like Webern. He does some Berg. Um, like that kind of style, continuing in that way. Um, and he's very good. But this one I kind of want to be more general. I don't have an extensive background in music theory or uh, anything like that. I'm not a composer. I'm basically just an obsessive listener. And when I think about how much I listen to classical music, I almost don't believe myself. I almost want to say like that has to be wrong. That has to be an exaggeration. But I listen to classical music, I would say on average like 2 to 3 hours a day. And that's average. Some days it's like 6 hours. Some days it's probably like 1 hour. But I would say there's very rarely a day where I'm listening to less than an hour. And that is excessive to some extent, but it doesn't give me cancer, so uh, yeah, kind of how I wanted to structure this video. I confined myself to one sheet of paper front and back, and I just wrote down a bunch of my favorite pieces, and I kind of split it by category of like symphony, string quartet, solo strings, solo piano, piano concerto, violin concerto, etc. So I'm going to kind of try to stick to categories like that. This isn't going to be chronological because most of mine are fairly concentrated in the romantic, late romantic, early 20th century. Basically, all of my favorites are. So it wouldn't be very exciting for me to do it chronologically. Um, but yeah, I suppose I'll just get into it. First, I wrote down symphonies, not for a particular reason, but the first that came to mind was Mahler's Fifth and Sixth Symphony. And one kind of reason, it may kind of be weird that Mahler's Fifth and Sixth are my favorites, but as you may know, I think all of his other symphonies have vocal sections where there's a group of singers singing whatever they do, and that's always been one shortcoming that I've had with classical music, where I almost it's like a 99% rule where if the piece has vocals in it, I don't listen to it, and I can appreciate it. So that almost completely cuts me off from opera. I I hardly ever listen to opera except for a couple like select arias like Purcell's Dido's Lament or like Bizet's stuff, Habanera. and just like random stuff like that that everyone knows. But yeah, I almost don't listen to opera. I haven't listened to Wagner hardly at all. I've never listened to a full Wagner opera, and just things like that. So Mahler's fifth and sixth. What strikes me most about Mahler, and this is something I think that you can take as a meaningful artistic wisdom in almost any artistic field that has to do with something over time. The beginning is vitally important. The first 30 seconds of a symphony or whatever, the first page of a book, it has to be extremely good. And this has kind of been on my mind because my friend has been reading Ulysses recently, and he keeps going back to the first chapter is perfect, and I agree. But I think, Joyce knew, Lawrence Stern knew. You can go down the list. The first, the first section is vitally important, and as pristine examples of this, Mahler's Fifth and Sixth Symphonies. I mean, who can't remember Mahler's the trumpet? I think it is in the fifth. The da 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 da, and then continuing, and then his sixth symphony starts out like you just jump in the middle of battle. Basically, it's like dun dun dun. But all right, I won't embarrass myself by trying to imitate more of his symphonies. But yeah, his fifth and sixth symphonies, I've listened to them countless times. I love them both very much. Um, Next, I wrote Tchaikovsky, all of Tchaikovsky's symphonies, and I've listened to all six many times. But as I'm sure is logical or reasonable, the fourth, fifth, and sixth are my favorites. And I can't say I could pick. The fourth is very good, but the top two are the fifth and sixth, and I couldn't say I could pick between the two which one I would prefer to listen to or be my favorite. I've probably listened to the fifth one more just because I got like really into it for a while and like only listened to that on repeat just constantly. But the sixth is amazing, the Pathétique Symphony, and everyone knows it. It's an extremely good work, and yeah. But if you guys haven't listened to his first three, they're very good too. He had his perfect ear for melody already, interesting like dance rhythms and things. So I would recommend his first three if you haven't, because I know they're less common. And then next I wrote all of Sibelius. I've listened to all seven of Sibelius symphonies many times. My favorites of the seven, I would say, are the third and fourth. The third is kind of funny because, what's the guy's name? Was it Howard Shore who did the Lord of the Rings stuff? Well, he used a lot of Sibelius in his film score for Lord of the Rings, and the third symphony has an extremely like visible quotation, like Howard Shore quoted the third symphony. It's like 10 minutes in. You'll know it if you listen to it, or if you've already listened to it, it's pretty obvious. But yeah, it's kind of funny that's so blatant. But and then his fourth symphony, it has a completely different character from the third. I would actually kind of compare it a little bit to Brahms' Fourth Symphony, as far as the like. It's like it's not. Yeah, this is a problem I always have with classical music. It's extremely difficult to talk about, and I'm sure it would make it a little easier if I knew all these, fancy music theory terms. But I just find a lot of them very bizarre. So I would say more like skeletal, the Brahms Fourth and Sibelius Fourth, but Sibelius definitely is still more in the like thoroughly romantic vein there still. Maybe late romantic, high romantic, but um, still definitely is in it. His first symphony is also extremely good, which coincidentally is heavily inspired by Tchaikovsky. I believe his first two are heavily inspired by Tchaikovsky, and um, they're very good. He knew who to be inspired by. And then next is Rachmaninoff. I put all of Rachmaninoff, and his first symphony was also inspired by Tchaikovsky, um, and that was one of his first works he did. I think he was what, like early 20s when he did his first symphony, and it got bad reviews, and it partially that, and I think Tchaikovsky died, and that basically threw him into a depression that took several years to fix. But then once he got out of it, he did his cello sonata, which is one of the most beautiful works ever. His cello sonata, the third movement, is just unbelievable. Um, and then he did his second piano concerto, which probably everyone knows, which is it's a masterpiece. You can't say anything about it. And he was only like, I think, early 30s when he wrote that. It's like, come on, man. There's no chance. You don't have a chance. And then Rachmaninoff's second symphony is extremely good too. It's quite long, but there's a section in it that's used in a lot of romance movies, which is really bizarre. It's really bizarre. Maybe it's because it's quoted from Tchaikovsky, maybe Romeo and Juliet. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, I just know a section of it is like really well known for being in romance stuff. And then next I have Dvorak, his 7th through 9th symphony, and his 8th. Well, obviously the 9th symphony completely overshadows probably anything else Dvorak put out, except maybe his humoresque. But it's extremely good, and I think Americans can especially appreciate it because he did use a lot of folk rhythms, maybe not rhythms so much as melodies, that you just can immediately take to, and the whole thing is amazing. But his 8th symphony, I have the feeling that he had the same technical skill. He just happened not to use American theme melodies. He used, I guess his Czech melodies or whatever he came up with in the 8th, and it still has the perfection of the 9th. I just think it doesn't happen to be as popular. And then also the 7th is extremely good too. And then next I wrote Beethoven, and I'm not trying to be a contrarian. I know his like his third, 7th, and 9th are probably his most famous symphonies. Oh, his 5th, obviously his 5th symphony. But that's like duh. Like that's like duh. But that probably has like 50 million views on YouTube, his 5th symphony. But yeah, other than that obvious one, probably his 3rd, which is played for a lot of like funerals and things, his 7th, and then his 9th, which is obvious, the Ode to Joy and things. But his 6th was really the one that struck me because I really enjoyed it for its, I can't remember what they call it. Is it called programmatic music? Where it's basically like in a forest, and then I think like what the 4th movement is like a storm, a thunderstorm, and then the 5th movement is like a calm bit. But yeah, it's basically, I think it's, the Pastoral Symphony. It's Pastoral Symphony. But yeah, I would say if you haven't listened to that one closely and you like his other like 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th, I would highly recommend his 6th symphony because it seems to be underappreciated, and I love it. And there was this recording by Bernard, and actually look closely at his name. Haytink, whatever. The Royal Concertgebouw, I think it was. And it was like a quicker recording than normal. It only took like 40 minutes. And I think that speed is perfect, but not many recordings for his Sixth Symphony do it that quickly. But if you can find that one, I would recommend that one especially. Next, I have a bit of an uncommon one, in contrast to all the ones I mentioned before. Vasily Kalinikov, his first symphony, and I think this one's getting more well known, but he was mostly known for his choral pieces, and he had a very precise ear for vocal melodies, which I think is a common denominator among extremely good melodists. That they had an extremely good ear for vocal melodies. Tchaikovsky is one good example of that. I think Chopin was also another, even though he didn't write uh, maybe any vocal music. Maybe he did. I don't listen to it very much, but um, yeah, Kalinikov. If you haven't listened to that one, it's extremely good melodies. I would put it in the tradition of Tchaikovsky. Um, and then next I have Shostakovich. I mean, come on, Shostakovich has been my he's been my guy recently. I've been listening to his. I'll go in later to his stuff, but his string quartets. Like I made a joke last night. I had to write a paper, and I started it 3 hours before it was due, and it took me 6 Shostakovich string quartets to finish it. So that's kind of how I tell time too. Is when I don't want to look at a clock or anything, I tell time by classical pieces, which I think is probably weird, but I do it. But anyway, Shostakovich symphonies. Basically, the obvious ones that I like. I like his fifth, his seventh, his 10th, and 11th. The fifth is really like really big. Um, I really like the recording of the finale by Leonard Bernstein, and he really gets his shoulders into it. Like he rolls his shoulders. I don't want to do it too much because it'll bob the camera, but yeah, if you watch it, it really I really get into it whenever I'm watching that Bernstein where he's wearing that white suit jacket doing the finale to Shostakovich Fifth Symphony. And then the seventh and 11th I like a lot, and I was just listening to I think it was the seventh the other day. That's the really long one, and at like the hour mark, you just hear this extremely, I would call it an extremely touching homage to Mahler. Yeah, it's about like the 55-minute mark or something. Throughout the symphony, you can kind of get glimpses of it, but it's extremely pronounced, like around the 55-minute mark. And it just struck me the other day as being so touching. And like, I really like that photo of Mahler sitting down, kind of turned to the side with his legs crossed with his glasses. It just struck me as like that photo. And yeah, I just kind of got such a nice feeling from it. And then next, I have Brahms, all of his symphonies, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I really like his first symphony, and that one was my favorite for a while of his. Just the beginning is very good, where it starts out and then kind of spreads out and spreads out and spreads out and then connects again. That's also the story about how he wrote it, how he took forever, I think 10 years, and like destroyed it multiple times because he wanted to live up to Beethoven, I think, something like that. And it's admirable that he had that idea. His second one is probably the one I've listened to the least, and I don't have a good reason for that. It just for whatever reason didn't strike me as much as his other three. His third symphony, I actually played part of it in an orchestra in my high school. We played the third movement, and I really enjoyed that. And then also his fourth symphony I played. Oh man, I can't remember. I think it was I think it was the fourth movement of it. I can't remember. It has been 4 or 5 years now. But yeah, we played a movement of that too. And I really like that symphony, but it seems more like refined or like more classical than his other stuff. And yeah, it's very interesting. And then last, I'm skipping over a bunch, but I've already gone 20 minutes only on this first bit. This is probably going to be, I don't want to go too long, but Bruckner and his Eighth Symphony. I like his other symphonies, but his Eighth is the best by far. And um, the the finale is just amazing. It's like apocalypse music. The very beginning, my favorite one is shoot, it's with an L. Who is he? Lauren Matzel. Yeah, that recording. Lauren Matzel. I think it's with the Chicago Symphony, which is really well known for its amazing brass section. But oh man, if you haven't heard that finale, just type it in. Bruckner Eighth Symphony finale. Man, just gorgeous, glorious. And then I'll try to go a little faster because I have a lot to get through. All right, string quartets are next, which were my first fascination in classical music. I really got into string quartets because I feel like with symphonies, you can't really hold all the parts in your head at once. I'm sure some people can. They'd have to be exceptional people. But with string quartets, you can. It's only four instruments, and often the violins are kind of working together, and then you have the viola and the cello, and you can usually pick out the instruments very easily, and that's one thing I really liked about string quartets, that you could capture all of it at once if you wanted. Um, so first I have Shostakovich. I mean, all 15 are amazing. I I have a like I said with my essay I was writing. I have a playlist of the Emerson String Quartet, which I think is the Borodin String Quartet is also very good, but for modern recordings, the Emerson String Quartet did a full cycle of them, and they're very good. Um, My favorites are his second string quartet, his fourth, the second string quartet, the second movement specifically, the recitative. It has an amazing section, and I don't know exactly what time it is in it, but it has like a three pizzicato where it starts high and drops and then drops. It's almost the perfect point in all of music. Like, I don't, it sounds ridiculous when I say that, but it's unbelievably perfect when it comes in that string quartet. But his fourth is also extremely good. Um, and it seems like those two aren't listened to very much, but yeah, I really recommend his fourth. His eighth is his most famous, and it's for the backstory behind it, and whether or not this is true, it doesn't really matter. It's a very good story. It's that he thought he was going to die soon, and some people say because of suicide. Some people say because it's just he was near Stalin and things, but um, he didn't think anyone would write funeral music for him, so he wrote his own funeral music, and that was the Eighth String Quartet. And I believe it's the third movement is the really aggressive. A lot of people like say, "Oh, he wrote heavy metal before heavy metal was around," but It's kind of a silly statement, but it kind of gets to the pathos of the movement. Um, and then I think is a good counterpoint his 15th string quartet, which was when he was in fact actually dying. He had a terminal illness, and he knew he was going to die. And there are some amazing sections in that piece. Um, I believe it's the third movement, the one with the really long, um, like crescendo and decrescendo with no vibrato. If you play that backwards, like if you put it in Audacity and play it backwards, it sounds very eerie and surreal. It does by itself going normal way, but man, if you put it backwards, it's crazy. And then, of course, you have to say Dvorak's number 12, the American string quartet. It's in his, I think his best time was, apart from a couple of pieces, but his best time was when he went to America. He had such an overflowing of genius, really. His 12th string quartet, I'm sure everyone's heard it. It's completely amazing. Then you have Indemit, his string quartets that he wrote when he was really young. I think he was in his like early to mid 20s, and they're still like late romantic. He really got into like some interesting stuff later in his career, but when he was young, he was completely late romantic. Like, not sure who I could compare him to really, but it gives you the same feeling as like Ravel. It kind of gives you that same time period feeling, or maybe even Debussy, but not quite, but it's in the same vein of those guys. Next, I have Kodai, who is the same. His string quartets, he never got as, like, I guess, diverse as Indemit did, but his string quartets are extremely good. There's some interesting, not sure what you'd say it, but it's like colorful visualizations of his string quartets. Online that I actually found him through that. And then Ravel, of course, his 1903 string quartet that failed to win that Paris Prix de Rome, was it? I don't know, whatever it is. But yeah, it's extremely good, which was, of course, inspired by Debussy's string quartet. I was just listening to both of them today. I was listening to a lot of Debussy's music recently, too. His sonatas, which I'll get to a little bit later. But what I really appreciate very precisely about Ravel's string quartet, Debussy's string quartet, and Debussy's sonatas, his string sonatas, is the pizzicato, the plucking. And I think that's what gets me about Shostakovich's second string quartet. The plucking is just such an interesting sound, especially like when it resonates correct. It's just, man, doesn't get much better than that. And then you have Tchaikovsky's first string quartet, which is one of the most calm pieces of music you can ever listen to. It's just like really drawn out and like mellifluous. It sounds like honey. Just extremely good. Oh, and then unfortunately, I don't overly enjoy Beethoven's string quartets. I mean, I could listen to them forever, but I don't listen to them often over these other string quartets I've mentioned, other than the shining exception is his 15th string quartet, the third movement, the Heiliger Dankesang, the Sacred Thanksgiving of the Convalescent. That's the full title. And it's one of those transcendental pieces of music that is one of the heights of humanity. And I don't feel exaggerated saying that. It's like a Bach Chaconne, the second partita, the fifth movement. It's just one of those transcendental human achievements that you hope everyone can experience in their life. Then next I have Mendelssohn's Sixth String Quartet, which is a very interesting work. I think it's his most interesting work that he made. Of course, he's very skilled in anything he did. If you listen to his works that he did when he was 13, they're just mind-boggling. But this six-string quartet, it was after his sister died, Fanny Mendelssohn, and if you know about his biography, you'll know he was extremely close with her, and you can tell it devastated him, completely annihilated him. But it he produced one of the most interesting pieces of music from his time. That six-string quartet. It's just timeless as far as what it has in it. Um, Next, I have Grieg's string quartet, which is one of the most powerful string quartets out there. It goes up there with Shostakovich's Eighth, which that's what Grieg's really good at. His piano concertos like that too. How it begins, you're just like, if anyone was feeling tired or solemn in a classical concert, just wait till they play Grieg. And then you have Janacek, his first and second string quartet. The second one, especially, Intimate Letters, is just perfect. The story behind it, too, how he had this unrequited love with this woman that he loved, and I think he was married the whole time. Either he was married or she was married, or they were both married, and it was kind of like platonic, but Janacek was like, come on. I've actually read some of the letters. It's an expensive book, unfortunately, but the letters were very good. And then I'll just go over two others really quick. Borodin, his... does he have more than one string quartet? I think it's his second string quartet. Yeah. His Notturno, specifically, the Nocturne, which I believe is a third movement. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of music. It reminds me of like it says Nocturne, but it reminds me of like that moment just before it's night and the sky is still like a bluish purple, and maybe like a Midsummer Night's Dream sort of feeling to it. But it's just one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever. And then last I have Schubert, his D887, and my favorite recording of this is the Hugo Wolf Quartet. Next I have solo strings. I have Kodai Sonata for Solo Cello, which is one of my top maybe 5 pieces of music in the world. I've listened to it over and over and over. My favorite recordings of it are Yo-Yo Ma has an extremely good recording, and then Janos Starker. Oh man, if you just watch him play that, there is nothing more disheartening as far as just seeing his perfection. He completely understands that piece, and there's an interesting story behind it. I think he first played it when he was really young, like mid-teens for Kodai. He actually knew him. And then I think he played it later. And I think Kodai said something like, if you just correct the retard in the third movement, it'll be a Bible performance. Like, it's like a 30-minute piece of completely virtuosic cello playing, and so it's funny statement. Next I have Ligeti's Sonata for Solo Cello, which is an amazing work. It's one of his early works, but I think he was around like 30 years old when he wrote it. The interesting part of it is the first movement, the dialogue. He wrote it for this girl that he really liked in his music school. She played the cello, and he wrote it for her, and she, how it's portrayed is she just thought it was a nice gesture, and she just accepted it, and didn't realize that Ligeti was completely infatuated by her and wrote it for her. And it's a genius piece of music, and it's just like, man, you would hope that story is fake, that she realized what it was. But man, it just makes me think all the stuff that guys have created because they liked women. We'd miss a lot of artwork if that trait didn't exist in people. Next I have Bach's Chaconne, Partita number 2, movement 5. I mean, it's just one of those works that if you don't like it, you might as well quit listening to music, really. I listened to it like 5 times the last couple days. It's just just amazing. Hilary Hahn has my favorite recording of it. Next, I have Ernst, his 6 polyphonic etudes. The most famous one, I think, is Midori's playing of the Last Rose of Summer, which was I don't know what you'd say, a variation or something on one of Mendelssohn's piano pieces, which is a very nice piece itself. But yeah, Ernst is his polyphonic etude of it is very good. And then last I have Heinrich Biber, his Passacaglia for solo violin, and he has it tuned as a scordatura, which means it's tuned differently than the normal G, D, A, and E for the violin. It's very good. He has some of the most unique violin works from before the 20th century, basically. Next, I'll do piano concertos. I have Tchaikovsky. I mean, come on, everyone knows it. The beginning is one of the most beautiful beginnings of any work ever. And there's an interesting story behind it. He apparently got the theme from listening to some peasant folk music players on the streets of, I believe it was St. Petersburg, but it may have been a town that he grew up in southern rural Russia. But yeah, anyway, he plucked that from some goofball who probably didn't know anything. Grieg, like I said, is extremely energetic piece, and the most amazing thing, and Julia Fischer is one of my favorite violinists, and she is also a virtuoso pianist. She can play Grieg's piano concerto, which I know is not one of the hardest, but come on. She is probably the best violinist alive now. And she can play virtuosic on the piano. She's a perfect human being. Next I have Rachmaninoff. I have his second piano concerto is just one of the masterpieces of classical music. Everyone can enjoy it. It starts out amazing, it ends amazing. I've listened to it, I don't know, 100 times. Next I have Brahms, his second piano concerto. I like his first piano concerto quite a lot, but the second one is just so calming and has a very good beginning. I really like Zimmermann's playing of it, Christian Zimmermann. Next I have Dvorak, which I think is not a very well-known piece by Dvorak, but it's very good. It's not as good as these others piano concertos I mentioned, but I would say in relation to its obscurity, it doesn't deserve the obscurity it has. Scriabin's piano concerto is very good. Garrick Olson, I think, is the guy. Yeah, he's my favorite player of it. There's a good recording on YouTube of Scriabin's piano concerto. It has very good melodies. And then Respighi, which is probably the least well-known of this whole list. And Respighi, really, I think he got the short end of the stick. He should be up there in the Rachmaninoff, the Tchaikovsky, as far as fame, Brahms, Ravel. He should be up there, but he isn't. And I don't know if it's because he's overshadowed by opera players in Italy or what, or opera composers in Italy, but he should be up there, as you'll see in my rest of my lists. Then we have violin concertos next, which was my fascination for a while since I play the violin. Tchaikovsky, I mean, obviously, Jascha Heifetz. There's nothing better than Jascha Heifetz playing some Tchaikovsky violin concerto. And there's a video of it on YouTube, and it's just amazing to watch. And then you have Brahms. Julia Fischer is my favorite recording of that. The first movement is amazing, and then you have the third movement, which is one of the most energetic movements, and the way Julia Fischer plays it, it's just so joyous and effusive and just so good. And then I have Philip Glass, his I believe it's his second violin concerto. It's the whatever one Adele Anthony plays with the Ulster Symphony Orchestra. It's basically a lot of arpeggios, but it's interesting that he can pull it off, make a lot of arpeggios sound extremely beautiful. Beethoven, I mean, come on, you have to say it. Uh, Respighi. And this, like I said, Respighi is underappreciated. His Concerto Gregoriano is one of the best violin concertos. I would put it up there with Tchaikovsky, Brahms, Dvorak. Of course, all these. They're all amazing, and it should be up there, but it isn't. It's not very well known, and it just baffles me. I can't figure out why. I cannot figure out why. And then as like an obscure, not as good as these other ones, but extremely good, is Axel Gade, is number 2, Violin Concerto number 2. Yeah, if you haven't listened to that, I'd recommend it. I think I'm going to cut this video here and do part 2, because I still have a lot left, and you'll have to forgive me, this is extremely indulgent, but I've always wished that there was a video like this on YouTube, just that I could, and like if other people made it, I would enjoy it, so I figured, screw it, I'll make one. So I'll continue the rest, where I talk about solo piano or general orchestral works and general chamber works. So see you then. Death is a gang boss.